Alright, a little bit of a forewarning in advance. This is officially an episode created in the new schedule, which means I may be interrupted at any moment in time. I'm actually recording this while the little one is down for her nap. So, just a heads up. So, welcome to episode 2 of the Trilogy of Terror. Now, okay. Unlike the previous episode, which I actually rather enjoyed, this one does have some rather serious logical flaws to it, which I'll be talking about in brief. But I want to mention something, because I actually started nitpicking this episode. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, why would you do that? Because nitpicking so often has a negative connotation to it, and for good reason. A lot of people do that basically just because they want to detract from the enjoyment of others. That's not what I mean, though. One of the things I used to do for other people, and have asked other people to do for me in the past, is given them a work, or they've given me a work, and they said, point out the flaws. And I don't mean the flaws in the writing. That's different. That's a form of editing. This is point out the flaws in the story, right? The plot holes. Find the plot holes. Find the things that don't make logical sense. Nitpick it, right? And so then I, go through and I'm like, well, this doesn't make sense and this doesn't make sense. And then I give it back to them and they say, okay, and they realize they have to now explain, why blah. It's very common. I've talked about this a dozen times in writing and across this series, which I swear is becoming more and more just an example of an analysis of writing in general and television production rather than just Voyager specific, but I digress. Getting from point A to point B is one of the more interesting challenges as a writer because more often than not, point B is something interesting. But point A has to also be interesting, and the conversion from point A to point B has to be interesting. That's writing. That's good writing, right? So, what happened here, this episode, the script was done by Brannon Braga, but before you think I'm bashing the man, Braga himself went on record saying that he found this episode bad. He hated the script for it. He hated the end result. He struggled with it. And I fully sympathize with him because I looked at the original story idea, which was pitched. I only got a skeleton. I didn't get the whole thing. And I looked at that and I was like, okay, now I'm going to pretend I'm Brannon Braga. I'm going to pretend I have been handed this story idea and told, make this into an episode. And it was pretty rough because, and it's hard to explain why, but basically the basic story idea is a very bare skeleton which doesn't really connect with itself that well. And again, that point A to point B thing is the person who pitched the original story idea didn't think about that at all. This is the kind of thing that would work better in something a little more fantastical like Outer Limits or Twilight Zone, because those things don't really have to make logical sense. When you pitch that to a science fiction show, especially one that's trying to be hard science fiction, even though Star Trek kind of wobbles around on that one, it's more inclined to try and make those things make sense. But the problem is, this skeleton of this idea doesn't make sense. For those of you who don't know, here's the basic skeleton idea. Okay. Neelix and Tuvok trapped. Neelix and Tuvok bond. Murder mystery with Neelix and Tuvok. Aliens attacking. Ticking clock. That's basically the skeleton right there. There's some other tidbits, the fact that they're going in a ship that's trying to rise into the atmosphere, that kind of stuff. Older tech, invasion, a bunch of little details, but that's the basic skeleton of the script. And the problem is getting that to make sense in Star Trek is harder to do than it sounds. Honestly, I probably would have gone a different direction with it, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So, it's kind of a shame. Like I said, I decided not to nitpick. I decided to just stop myself after a while, although what I mean by that is stop writing it down, because even by the last scene of the episode, I was still thinking, well, that doesn't make sense. Like I said, when Braga himself comes out and says, this is a bad script, something's wrong, and it really shows in the dialogue especially. A lot of it is very forced, and a lot of the elements are very, it's happening because the plot demands it, rather than it's happening because it makes logical sense, or, it follows the progression of the themes, or is significant to character development, or otherwise services the story in any way. No, it's just happening because it has to happen for us to get to the next scene. And it's a shame because I still wouldn't call this a bad episode. There's actually some really good stuff in this. Ethan Phillips gets a great performance of Neelix, shows off his chops, and really helps develop the character. His scene, especially, excuse me, when he's explaining about his dead family to someone who is effectively a complete stranger, who also just recently held him at knife point, really, really showed an insight into Neelix's character. The way he talked about it, the way he was talking about, it's okay. I know, he talks about it. He's got that kind of light chipper tone, and then his entire voice changes. It just utterly changes. His tone, his pacing of his words, all changes. He says they're all dead. They were all killed in a war, and he just says it. And then you look at her face and it's like, oh my God, I'm sorry. And then he like switches the mask back on. He goes back to that toy. He's like, no, it's okay. And it's also interesting because that is kind of how emotional growth happens in real life. We never actually get over tragedies, not really. All we do is learn to live with them, learn to cope with them. And that is how Neelix has coped. And we see probably the first time, and I think the only time, how Neelix copes with the horrible things that went through his life. And I liked that. That was great. That's great stuff. The very concept of being on this, this coffin of a ship that's not even a ship, it's a freaking elevator, and being trapped between, trying to get up into space where bad things will happen if anything goes wrong, or not trying to fall to the ground, which would be a long fall and a slow and horrible death. Yeah, it's an engaging, a very suspenseful environment, and yet at no point did it actually engender real tension within me, because it was just like, oh, and then this happens because it has to in order to further, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to bash the episode anymore. I've kind of already said my piece on that. I want to comment on a few things, though, kind of story-wise. First of all, I want to give special praise to the special effects for this episode and the director. The special effects in this episode really did a surprisingly good job, especially for the era. This is Voyager. This is just after they started getting CGI as a regular feature on the show, and yeah, they actually sold me pretty well. I mean, yeah, it looks dated. Yeah, you can tell he's in front of a blue screen, but it doesn't look bad. At no point did I go, ugh. There's a difference between old graphics and bad graphics, and I think aesthetically it has worked very well. The director also did a lot of really good work with the set designers in order to make the coffin, the ship, feel like the elevator that's moving up into the sky rather than a square room. Because it was just this one set, and he managed to do a lot of work with that set and did a very good job of it, so definite props there. A lot of use of camera angles and stuff like that. One piece I especially liked, that was a really nice little touch, is when the thing takes off, he has the camera lower behind a console. So from your perspective, it looks like they're rising up. A dinky little touch, but nice little stuff like that. There's a lot of little touches like that. It was also nice to see Neelix being Neelix without being irritating. He was very eager, he was very excited, he was very nervous and anxious, and yet he actually showed that he was, interested in things, and never pushed his boundaries. There's only one piece he had that made me go, huh? And that was the thing where he mentioned that he flat out lied to Tuvok in order to sell him on this plan, which is various levels of stupid I don't feel like going into. But ignoring that, overall, they did do a pretty good job of making him, Neelix, as opposed to, yeah. I really like the confrontation scene between Tuvok and Neelix. It's a wonderful scene, and it should have been, in fact, for all intents and purposes, it was the dramatic climax of the episode. Everything after that was just a downhill slide, both in quality, but in overall pace and tone. The way Neelix just explodes at Tuvok, I'm kind of totally with Neelix on this one. I hate to say that. See, here's the thing. I get the Vulcan philosophy. I really do. I'm not going to say I agree with it, but I totally understand it. But one thing we have always known is that the Vulcans do have emotions, and those emotions do affect them. And they do tend to have a rather significant superiority complex because they are basically superior. It's hard not to feel superior when you are, right? And yet, what has been shown time and time again is the Vulcans do not have all the answers. And forgive me for pulling a quote out here, but logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. I feel Spock himself is probably the person who most personifies what the Vulcan ideal should be. This is just my opinion, of course. And I know this is dangerous territory because there are some Trek fans who would eat me alive for this, but it's okay. Only like 500 of you watch this episode, so it's all good. Watch. A few years from now, this will become a big feature, and I'll have Star Trek fans crawling down my throat. But my point is, way too often the Vulcans tend to naturally view things as, I am right always, and therefore I am always going to be right. And actually, as funny as it sounds, that's not logical. You know, it's the old fallacy of, I forget the actual phrase, but basically, just because A and B equal up to C does not mean A and B will always equal up to C. That's basically what it boils down to. And I feel like the Vulcans I tend to enjoy most across the series are the ones who are willing to listen. They still put forth their opinion, they still put forth their logic, but they're at least willing to listen to the input from others. And it's kind of funny because Tuvok was willing to listen in this case. And it was a great scene. It's just ruined because Neelix is basically totally wrong. The script was engineered so that he was right, but for all intents and purposes, Neelix was wrong. If I was on that thing as a flesh and blood, plenty of emotions human, I would have said, no, Neelix, you're a retard. You are basing this off of a man who was in the middle of delirium, and it's called delirium for a reason, Neelix. This man was going to die, or worse, because he was delirious. So no, the script should have been structured a little bit better so that we could actually see Neelix's point, rather than the script just kind of artificially making him correct on the matter. But I digress again. I really, I have a note here that says, I'm not going to comment. What I mean by that is, the physics of this episode are just wrong. I'm just going to say it, with regards to the asteroids, with regards to the elevator, with regards to being out on an elevator several kilometers above the surface of a planet. No, I'm just not even going to comment on it. Not even going to comment on it, leaving it alone, whatever. One other thing I do want to comment on here really quick, this is kind of a parallel to Babylon 5. I really do find the idea of asteroids as a weapon fascinating because it's horrifying. I mean, if you think about it, asteroids as a weapon is something that would be tremendously, monumentally devastating. And the reason this ties into Babylon 5 is because those of you who've seen Babylon 5 already know, and those of you who haven't, I'm not going to say anything. But I've probably already given away too much. Asteroids as weapons. Yeah, the general concept is referred to as a mass driver. In other words, something that propels a large mass towards something, and because you're in space, it just, you know, none of those other things that would get in the way do. Imagine if you had a gun that could shoot a bullet that's like 50 feet wide, and nothing was going to interfere with the momentum of that bullet, so it's still going at the full speed of a bullet. It's just this big. The kinetic energy that would unleash, the amount of mass displaced, the amount of destructive energy created by the friction as it collides, you know, it's immeasurably devastating. So when you start flinging asteroids at a planet, wow! Now the interesting thing to me is you're probably, okay, for a while there, I've been kind of off and on with my Arshan Gaia's edition of Voyager, which is actually Arshan Gaia's second edition of Voyager, as we've already discussed. Taking this episode, I gotta admit, if I was going to do a rewrite of this episode, I would use the janitor method of writing, which I'm not going to explain to you very briefly. My first job was as a janitor way back when I was in the, well, younger. When I was about a quarter my current age. But one of the things I learned early on is you can't just clean something once and then consider it clean. At least not with everything. Sometimes you can do that. But with things that are either really dirty or really need to be very clean or are very difficult to clean or whatever, you clean it, and then you clean it again, and then you clean it again, and you keep doing that until it is to your satisfaction. You learn that kind of patience doing that sort of thing. I've often credited my work as a janitor as one of the things that helped teach me patience when I was younger. Which brings me to my point. A script like this needs to be doctored. It needs to be worked, and then reworked, and then reworked, and just keep rewriting it over and over to try and smooth out the edges and polish out all the different problems and difficulties. Because again, this is a really difficult episode to work with. But in the interest of fairness, without any prep work at all, I'm going to do this little trick again. I'm going to go ahead and try to toss out my version of the script without having thought about it in advance. So That being said, the first thing that I can kind of tell you this right off the top of my head. The first thing I would do is get rid of the aliens, not the aliens we're trying to help, the invading aliens. Now it's funny, you probably look at me weird because I say that, even though they have an interesting approach to things. The idea of trying to encourage people to leave settlements so that you can then claim them is not exactly an uninteresting concept. And it's, even though we get that tiny little glimpse of their culture and their mentality, that was interesting enough for me to want to know more. But when it really comes down to this episode, the aliens don't actually add anything except for a ticking clock. I mean, think about this for a moment. These aliens show up and say, "This is ours," blah. And they beat the crap out of Voyager, who beams them up through the shields. I'm not even... And then it is more than a match for the Voyager. I want to stress this again. Because, again, logically, that means they're big news. This is one of their ships, and one of their ships is outmatching the Intrepid class. So they've got all this firepower and significance. What's to stop them from coming back and doing this again anytime in the future? This is also a species who sees nothing wrong with flinging asteroids at people, which in most science fiction settings is considered one of the highest forms of war crimes, above biological weapons. Okay? So there's a lot to be said about that race, there's a lot to be said about that species, and there's a lot to be said about how they don't deserve to be in this episode, because they deserve either an entire episode devoted to themselves. You know, there's this horrible race which thinks there's nothing wrong with that. You know, you could examine the culture of such a species, or just get rid of them entirely. So let's axe them, okay? First thing we're doing, we're axing them. Now, unfortunately, as per my own rules, I have to maintain the core of an episode. So we're going to pretend I'm in Braga's place. You know, okay, here's the skeleton. Oh, God, really? So I have to maintain this murder mystery thing. Why not make the asteroids a natural disaster thing? I can think of several ways to go with that. The most obvious one being something happened to the moon some time ago, and they've settled this place for some time. I mean, this is not exactly a new settlement, but over time, the rate of the rate of decay of the orbit of the moon chunks has been increasing to the point where they're going to lose orbit. They're going to collide with the planet, right? Which is going to be a horribly bad thing. And yet the people in charge of the astronomical division or whatever who are monitoring this sort of thing, for whatever reason, and I'm just going to put that out there, for whatever reason are encouraged not to release that information to their actual leaders, okay? So nothing is done about this, even though they have tons and tons of advanced warning. And it's not even hard to think about this. This is the kind of thing most people would just accept, even without explanation. Maybe it was just bureaucracy. Maybe the paperwork was still stuck somewhere. Maybe someone was worried about not getting reelected because he didn't want to be the person who, you know, brought the news of doom to this brand new prospering colony. It's very easy to think about someone who is not thinking about the long term or the overall picture and is just thinking about themselves, and therefore they allow something like this to happen. So then we get to the point where the episode actually begins, which is when those chunks of the moon are actually starting to collide with the planet and creating all the problems that would involve. Now, the thing is, honestly, if I'm being blunt, in that situation, evacuation's what you want to do, but let's assume for a moment that they don't want to do that. This brings us to our next little thematic story idea. They go down, Tuvok and Neelix. Definitely want to keep that, because there's some good stuff there. Wouldn't change most of the individual Tuvok and Neelix things. I would just try to connect them a little bit better. Send them down with a few members of the other side, with a few members of these people, and some of them that they find down there. And it would have to be at least 3, which is funny because there's actually 4 total that we see. One of them would have to be just a miner, like there was. Down-to-earth miner. I would actually probably have the woman be the miner, personally. She was a good guest star. She did some good work on acting, and overall she sold her part a lot better than I'm the random obstinate guy, whose job was to be the random obstinate guy. So let's just, no. Random miner, let's have someone who actually lives there and is actually rather wealthy. Not like super rich or anything like that. Just someone who's comfortable. You know, like, well, I don't want to name examples, but like someone who can afford something like an extra car because they want a new car. You know, that kind of wealth, okay? So someone like that who lives rather wealthy because of this settlement, because of the ore deposits that are in the settlement, okay? Pretty easy to understand. Let's send at least one government official down there, someone who is aware of this, you know, keep the thing quiet thing, and maybe someone else involved in that. Now, the point behind this The point behind sending these people down here from a thematic perspective is Neelix and Tuvok naturally have rather simultaneously conflicting and what's the word I'm looking for? They have complementary personality types. They really do, if you think about it. Neelix is very thinking on his feet, doesn't plan ahead, has his so-called instincts, whatever you want to make of that, and is very emotional. Tuvok is basically the total opposite of that. But those two things, when used together in cohesion, can actually make a very dynamic team. We've seen that before. It's called Kirk and Spock, for God's sakes. But I digress. So, and not that I'm trying to say Neelix is Kirk, my God, no. but it's true. This is the kind of thing that works. So have these two people trying to get... they get down there. They go in. They start investigating one of the areas. They find several of the people down there, including the miner. They get back. Shuttle sabotaged. Now, why would the shuttle be sabotaged? You already know where I'm going with this. You can already guess it. It's because one of the people involved has specifically sabotaged it, and it would probably be the government person who was responsible for it, but it would actually be the miner who was hired to do it. Because that miner doesn't have that much money, right? The miner doesn't really have much going for her. But so she goes ahead and it does this thing in exchange for money because, well, she's just thinking about herself, isn't she? She's just thinking about tomorrow, not the next 50 days or the next 100 days. So she doesn't realize what she's done. She's just, okay, it's just a job to her. And then there's the wealthy individual. Well, the wealthy individual is more than capable of putting two and two together because he's smart. There's a reason he's so wealthy. And he already knows the secret, the big, conspiracy or whatever you want to call it, but he doesn't care. He is more than capable of, from his perspective, and he would actually give a speech about this, what does it matter? Once the moon decays to a certain point, we can just evacuate the planet, wait it out. It'll take, and he'll already have surveys done. It'll take, 37 years for the damage to fall down, and then we can come back and resettle. It's fine. What's the problem? And he'll have made tons of money in the meantime. And of course, the government person is being paid off by people like the rich person in order to keep things quiet, in order to keep his job, in order to make sure he doesn't slander his boss. And let's go ahead and make the government guy not stereotypically evil. Add a little bit of gray in there. Make it so that he is just a official, a bureaucrat, basically, right? Someone who is... You can tell I do character-driven stories, can't you? I just realized all I'm doing is describing the characters here. Make him a bureaucrat. Make him someone who doesn't want to lose his job, okay? Make him someone who has already aware of the fact that other people have tried to bring it up to the heads of the astronomical department saying, hey, there's this problem, and those people have been fired and discredited. So he knows there's a problem, and it's not like he wants it to keep going. It's not like he's actually benefiting, per se, from all those kickbacks or whatever, from bribery. He just wants to keep his job. You see the common thread here. The idea here is to show that the two sides of a possible societal dichotomy here. On the Neelix and Tuvok side, we see two people who, despite all of their disagreements and their antagonism and all the problems that they have as far as their friendship and whatnot in their working professional environment, those two people are basically fully committed to each other and towards the idea of the so-called greater good, the ideal, if you will, of the ideal of Star Trek. On the other side, we see people who are not evil. They are just people who are just interested in themselves and their family and the immediate things that interest them. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But when you have lots of people doing that all at the same time, you cause problems like the moon colliding with your planet and getting in the way of fixing that. And as much as I can't believe I'm saying this, I would lead this into a prime directive discussion towards the end. We solve the murder mystery because there has to be a murder mystery because I'm limited to that. If anything, I would probably actually have the miner be the one who is killed to cover tracks, that kind of a thing. The miner or the wealthy individual, both of them would be serve the same purpose story-wise. Both of them would be gotten rid of because that way it covers the tracks of the individual in question, and both of them would also throw suspicion on the other when it comes to presentation of the story. But I digress. we resolve that. We find out about, oh my god, you've known about this for like the last 50 years? What the hell? You know, that kind of a thing. Managed to get the shuttle working, managed to get up to the ship. There's no alien invasion, so Voyager's just up there trying to find them amongst this mineral ore field of doom, which is scattering all sorts of sensors all over the place. And, you know, one of the first things they say is, okay, the moon's going to keep coming down, we need to evacuate. Oh my god. And Captain's like, oh my god, Ambassador, we need to evacuate your people. And he's like, well, no, hang on a second. Except not Ambassador, like Governor. Governor, we need to evacuate your people. Well, no, hang on. And you know where this is going, because he wants to get reelected. Being the governor who evacuated a planet in its time of need is not exactly someone who's going to be very popular with people who just got rooted up and lost their homes and all their things, probably, as well. And so the reason this would lead into a prime directive thing is because the question we made, well, what do we do about this? Do we just leave these people to die? I mean, it's basically their choice to die. Now, you probably know the direction I'm leaning in this one. But I would have Tuvok and Neelix both come to Janeway at the end of this episode, and both give the logical and emotional answer, and it happens to be the same answer. We should help evacuate these people. Why? Yes, it's a violation of Prime Directive. But at the same time, it kind of isn't, if you follow. Because it isn't violating the spirit of the law, only the letter of the law. The idea here is, if a planet was being attacked by a natural disaster that people had no ability to deal with, do you swoop in and help? Forgive me for quoting Spock for the 100th time here, but well, actually, it's Kirk. Kirk is the one who says the words. Kirk says, we will, irrevocably change our society, but that's better than extinction. And Spock's response to that is logical. Spock agrees with him. Kirk agrees. I agree with that sentiment. Yes, this is something that we would avoid under normal circumstances, but if we don't, they will die, and that is considered worse, therefore we're going to intervene. Okay? So this is effectively being considered a natural disaster situation because ultimately no one's really to blame here. They're not deliberately deciding to stay. They're staying out of ignorance. They're staying because their leadership has failed them. Now, I'm not saying we need to step in and fix the leadership. I'm not saying we need to step in and tell all the people the truth. I'm saying we need to help save their lives, and then let the people figure out their own government problems for themselves, right? And this is also a great way that Neelix could come in and show his own acumen right at the end there. Contact insert species here, who happen to have super transports in the area. The kind of things that can actually carry 5,000 people. And there you go, get them off, get that thing. Little examination, nice contrast between most societies, and to show just how far the Federation overall Starfleet society kind of is in comparison to other societies. I shouldn't say how far, that means it's better, but the point is how different it is. And there's a murder mystery for some freaking reason. Why is that in this? I digress. You're probably tired of hearing me. And she's supposed to wake up at any moment now. I apologize for a relatively short episode. I also apologize because I feel like I didn't really have anything to comment on other than my whole thing about the A to B problem. One last note about the A to B problem, if I may. If you really want to get to a point B, and you write something out, and it's like, nah, this doesn't work, and you do something else, and that doesn't work, do yourself a favor and don't just try to rush it. This is one of the most common things. I've talked about this before. This is one of the most common things I see writers do that is a mistake. They just try to rush to the good stuff. Don't do that. It doesn't work. It makes it look worse. It makes it look badly written. It makes it look amateurish. And unless you build up to it, your payoff, the point B, that's the good stuff that you really want to get to, is going to have no impact. It's going to just be like, okay, if I can use a Star Trek example of this, imagine if Picard is there, and then he sees the Borg, and then as soon as he sees the Borg, this is a slight exaggeration, but I've seen writers do this. As soon as he sees the Borg, they attack his ship. This is way back in Q2. They attack his ship, and they lose the 17 members, and he gives that awesome speech from First Contact. That speech has no power behind it unless you have the establishment first. Think of building up to a point as the fuel. You want as much fuel there as you can without going overboard, because it is possible to take too long to pay off. See the X-Files for a good example of this. But you want as much fuel there as you can so that when the payoff happens, when the engines are ignited, it's a big, satisfying burn. We saw Picard's first reaction in Q. We saw Picard be assimilated. We saw him break down in family. We saw him rethink his opinions on Iborg. We saw him throughout First Contact facing his literal demons, his nemesis, his Khan. So that when that speech finally came, that payoff was huge. You build up to it. Be patient. I know you want to get to that speech because you've already written the speech. You already know how it's going to go. Work up to it. Take your time. Okay, that's my honest advice. Take your time. Work on it naturally. And use the janitor method if you have to. I'll see you guys next one.
You are becoming emotionally distraught. There is little point in furthering this discussion.
I'll tell you who's being emotional. You. You hide it beneath that Vulcan calm, but the truth is you're filled with contempt and sarcasm, and I'm tired of being the target of all your hostility.
You are mistaken.
No, he's not. I can see it every time you talk to Neelix. You're dismissive and condescending.
You are projecting your own emotional bias onto my actions. I have no feelings toward Mr. Neelix.
That's right! That's exactly what I'm talking about. You have no feelings for me. But you have feelings against me. For 3 years, you've ridiculed me and made it obvious to everyone that you have no respect for me. And I've tolerated it. You know why? You know why? Because you are smarter than I am, Tuvok. And more logical and stronger and superior in almost every way. And I admire you. But you don't have any instincts. You don't have any gut feelings. And you don't really understand people.